12 men held their breath and did not know why. Then he said her name, softly, as if he had carried it somewhere private for a long time and had not meant to say it out loud. Silera. And in 20 years of service, Master de Greaves, the Count's own secretary, had never once heard that man speak a servant's name. What happened next would be told in whispers across the territory for years to come. Count Ulrich Voss, the man who had ended a border war by returning a general's severed hand, looked at the empty chair beside him. The heir's seat, the wife's seat, the seat that had been deliberately, pointedly empty for a decade, and told her to sit. Not the lords, not the Duke, who was already opening his mouth in outrage. Her. He told the tea-girl to sit beside him. And then, before the outrage could find its voice, before the room could decide what to do with the impossible thing it had just witnessed, Count Ulrich Voss turned slightly in his chair, closed his eyes, and fell asleep on Silera's shoulder. For the first time in 6 months, he simply stopped. The tremor in his left hand, the one he always hid beneath the table, went still. The hard line between his brows dissolved. He breathed slowly and deeply, like a man who had finally at great cost laid something heavy down. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 12 of the most powerful men in the territory stood frozen, staring at a sleeping Count and a tea-girl who was trying very hard not to show, on her face, the storm of thoughts crashing through her mind. Because Silera was not moved. She was not flattered. She was not softened by the strange, quiet trust of a man the whole world feared resting his head against her shoulder. She was furious. She had a life. She had a shift that ended at noon, a mother who expected her home, a body that had needs and feelings and opinions, none of which had been consulted. She had been turned into furniture again, just more visible furniture this time. Furniture a powerful man had decided to sleep on, in public, in front of an audience, without asking. And the worst part, the part that made the anger burn hotter and more complicated than she wanted it to be, was that she could not move. Because Master Greaves was already at her ear, voice barely a breath, "Do not wake him." And she already knew with a certainty she resented that she would not. Because something in the weight of his head against her shoulder told her, against her will, against all logic, against everything she knew about the difference between lords and tea-girls, and the vast, unabridgeable distance between them, that this man was not resting, he was hiding. And whatever had broken him badly enough to steal 6 months of sleep had just inexplicably, impossibly decided that she was safe. Stay with us, because this is only the beginning. If you enjoy this story so far, support the creator's journey by clicking on the subscription icon, like and comment on the video as it helps the channel to grow. Welcome. Chapter 1. They said Count Ulrich Voss had not slept in 6 months, not 1 hour. Not one stolen minute in a chair or a carriage or the dead quiet of a winter midnight when even the guards dozed at their posts. 6 months of open eyes and a mind that would not stop. And still, every morning, he rose before dawn, dressed without assistance, and walked into his council chamber like a man who had simply decided that sleep was a weakness he no longer had use for. The physicians came first. They prescribed tinctures of valerian and poppy, warm baths drawn at midnight, the removal of all candlelight from the sleeping quarters after the 9th hour. The Count dismissed them in the same tone he used to dismiss petitions he found unworthy of his time, quiet, final, and carrying the specific temperature of a door closing. The priests came second. They burned sage and spoke of spiritual imbalance and recommended fasting and prayer. He sent them away faster than he had sent the physicians. He did not fast, he did not pray, and he did not sleep. What nobody said, what nobody dared say, was that they could see it happening to him, slowly, the way a crack moves through stone. Not in any single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small things. The tremor in his left hand that appeared somewhere around the 3rd month, and which he had learned to hide beneath the council table. The way his handwriting, always as precise and controlled as everything else about him, had begun to lose its sharpness at the edges of long documents. The way he sometimes paused mid-sentence, for just a half-second too long, as if he had momentarily lost the thread between his thought and his tongue. His lords noticed, his secretary noticed. Not one of them said a word. You did not offer concern to Count Ulrich Voss. You kept your distance, you completed your tasks, and you thanked whatever you believed in that his attention had not landed on you today. He had earned that fear honestly. The territory of Vethara under his rule was the most orderly, most prosperous, and most quietly terrified duchy in the northern reaches. Trade routes ran on time. Tax records were immaculate. Crime had dropped to levels that neighboring lords studied with a mixture of admiration and unease, because they understood, reading between the numbers, that the crime had not disappeared. It had simply learned to be invisible. Disorder in Vethara did not go unpunished. It went unforgiven. There was a difference, and under Count Aldrich, that difference was the entire point. The border war of his 28th year was the story most often told about him, usually in hushed voices, and usually with the speaker glancing at the door first. The enemy general had sent a letter demanding territorial concession. Count Aldrich had sent back a reply containing no words at all, only the general's own signet ring, still on the general's finger, separated at the wrist with what the physicians later confirmed was a single, extremely precise cut. The war ended in 11 days. Nobody asked questions. Nobody started another war with Vethara for 4 years after that. He was 32 years old. He had no wife, no heir, no close companion that anyone had ever observed. He had Master Greaves, his secretary of 20 years, who served him with the loyalty of a man who had watched him grow from a boy into something formidable and had decided, somewhere along the way, that formidable was not the same as lost. He had his lords who respected him and feared him and would have been genuinely uncertain which feeling was stronger. He had his territory, his walls, his ledgers and his maps. He had everything a count could want and nothing, absolutely nothing, that a man might need. And then there was the name. It had come to him 6 months ago, the same night the sleep stopped. He could not explain it. He had no memory of dreaming it, no memory of hearing it spoken aloud. He only knew that sometime in the small, dark hours of a November night, he had sat up in bed with the absolute and sourceless certainty that someone had just said a name in the room, and the name was Silera, and the room was empty, and the feeling it left behind was not fear but something older and quieter. The feeling of a door he had sealed a long time ago, trembling very slightly on its hinges. He had not spoken the name. He did not permit himself to think about it. Some men carry grief like a wound they tend carefully, cleaning it, dressing it, keeping it alive because the pain is the last proof that the loss was real. Count Aldrich had chosen a different approach. He had taken his grief at 20 years old and built 4 walls around it and stationed guards and walked away. And he had not looked back, and he had been perfectly fine. He had been perfectly fine for 12 years. He had not slept in 6 months. The name belonged to a girl his mother had loved like a sister, a handmaid who had died of fever when Aldrich was 12 years old, and his mother's world had cracked quietly in half in a way she never fully recovered from. Silera. He had been there when his mother received the news. He had watched a woman he loved become someone slightly smaller, slightly dimmer, permanently. He had been 12 and helpless, and he had learned, in that room, on that afternoon, that love was a catastrophic liability, that it handed other people the precise instrument required to unmake you, and they did not even have to mean to use it. He had been a very apt student of that lesson. He had not unlearned it in 20 years. But the name had come back, in the dark, without permission, and 6 months later, in the Grand Council chamber, surrounded by 12 powerful men who feared him, it would come out of his mouth again. Not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as something startlingly, impossibly present. As a tea girl set down his cup, and he looked up and the room stopped. Chapter 2, they did not move him. That was the first decision, made within seconds of the chamber going silent. Master Greaves, standing very still in the doorway, taking sight of the most feared count in the northern territories asleep on the shoulder of the tea girl, and concluding with the calm pragmatism of a man who had served the Voss family for 30 years, that waking him was not an option anyone in this room was willing to be responsible for. The lords filed out in absolute silence. Not the silence of respect, the silence of men who have witnessed something they cannot yet categorize, and have decided collectively that the safest response is to be elsewhere. Duke Harren was the last to leave. He paused at the door and looked back once, at the sleeping count, at Silera's rigid spine, at the spilled tea cooling in its Orsa, and whatever he saw in that tableau kept him quiet all the way down the corridor and for a considerable time afterward. And then it was just Silera, and the man sleeping on her shoulder, and the rest of her life, suddenly and without negotiation, on hold. Day 1. The first hour she was too stunned to be angry. She sat with the straightness of someone who has been told not to move and has decided to take that instruction with extreme literal seriousness, and she stared at the obsidian table, and she counted things. The ceiling panels, 63. The candles still burning in the morning light, 11. The number of times she had imagined, in 4 years of carrying trays through this keep, that she would one day sit in the council chamber. 0. It had never occurred to her. Rooms like this were not rooms she was meant to be in. She was meant to pour into them and then leave, and the world made a certain quiet sense when she did. The second hour, the feeling came back to her left arm and then immediately went away again, and she understood that this was going to get significantly worse before it got better. The third hour, the anger arrived. It came the way real anger always comes, not as a sudden eruption but as a tide, slow and heavy and rising, filling every low place first. She had a shift that ended at noon. She had bread rising in the kitchen that someone else would now have to punch down. She had a mother 3 streets outside the keep walls who would wait for her daughter's knock at the end of the day and hear nothing, and worry quietly in the way mothers worry. Not loudly, not with drama, but with a specific, patient, grinding dread that wore grooves in a person over time. She had all of this, and none of it had been asked about, because it had not occurred to the man sleeping on her shoulder, or to the secretary who had told her not to move, or to the lords who had filed out in their fine coats, that she might have a life that existed outside of their line of sight. Petra came at midday with a tray, not a service tray, a personal one, set for one. Bread, soft cheese, dried apricots, a cup of water placed within reach of Silera's free hand. Petra's face, when she set it down, was a precise portrait of someone attempting not to show what they were feeling and failing completely. She pointed at the food with an encouraging look. She mouthed the words, "I am so sorry." She left before Silera could respond, because what was there to say? Silera ate with her right hand. She did not spill anything. She was, by this point, developing a very focused relationship with the concept of physical control. Day 2. The arm had gone from painful to numb to a strange, distant buzzing that she had decided to simply accept as her new reality, the way one accepts rain. She had stopped counting ceiling panels and started, instead, thinking, really thinking, the long, uninterrupted kind that her actual life rarely permitted. Thinking about the gap between the world as it presented itself and the world as it was. About how many times, in 4 years of carrying trays through this keep, she had been in the room where a decision was being made without anyone pausing to consider whether she had a thought about it. About how invisible a person could become simply by being useful. About how that invisibility was not an accident, it was architecture. Built deliberately, maintained carefully, because a world where the people who carried the trays were also seen as people with interior lives and valid opinions was a significantly more complicated world to govern. The Count slept on. His breathing had the deep, surrendered quality of someone in the grip of something their body had needed for a very long time. Once, in the deepest part of the second night, she heard him exhale in a way that sounded almost like relief. Not a sound she would have associated with him, having heard him, in 4 years, produce only sounds of command or dismissal, or a silence, so pointed it functioned as both. This was different. This was private. She felt, against her better judgment, like an intruder witnessing something she had not been meant to see. And then, somewhere in the black middle of that second night, he spoke. Not words, not at first. Just sounds, low and shapeless, the way people speak in sleep when the mouth moves before the mind has organized anything into language. But then, clearly, quietly, in a voice she had never heard him use, softer than his waking voice, unguarded in a way his waking voice never was, he said a name, her name. Not as a command, not as the flat, transactional acknowledgement he had given her across the council table that morning, a lifetime ago. He said it the way people say the names of things they are afraid of losing. Silera, as if it were the end of a sentence he had been trying to finish for a very long time, as if it were an answer to a question he had not known he was asking. She sat with that for a long time afterward. The anger was still there. She had not put it down. She was not ready to put it down, but something had shifted underneath it, the way furniture shifts when the floor moves. She was furious that she was here. She was furious that no one had asked. She was furious that the world had arranged itself, yet again, so that her comfort was the least important variable in any given equation. And she was also sitting very still in the dark with his sleeping weight against her shoulder, deeply and unwillingly curious about who he was when no one was watching. Day 3. Master Greaves came in the morning of the third day and told her the truth about the name. He did not do it easily. He stood beside her, with his hands folded behind his back, and he looked at the window rather than at her face, the way people look away when they are saying something that costs them. And he told her about a woman who had died 20 years ago. A handmaid, beloved, gone in the swift, indifferent way that fever takes people. Quickly, without negotiating, without leaving enough time for anything to be said. He told her that the Count had been 12 years old when it happened, that he had loved his mother, that he had watched his mother become someone smaller in that room, on that afternoon, and had learned the lesson that grief teaches the young most efficiently, that love is exposure, and exposure is danger, and the safest position is behind very thick walls, built early and maintained constantly. He had not said that name in 20 years. He had not, as far as Master Greaves knew, permitted himself to think it. The mind denied permission, reroutes, it buries. But 20 years of burial does not make a thing gone. It only makes it deeper, and depth, eventually, is just pressure. And pressure, given time, finds a crack. Silera listened to all of this without speaking. When Greaves finished and looked at her, waiting, she said only, "He carries it alone then." And Greaves said very quietly, "He carries everything alone. He does not know another way." And Silera looked at the sleeping man who had ended a war with a severed hand and could not stay awake in the presence of a tea-girl, and she felt the anger shift again, not dissolving, not abandoning her, but making room. Making room for something more complicated, something that looked, from the inside, uncomfortably like understanding. She did not like it. She had not asked for it. She was, in her opinion, already doing quite enough. He woke on the morning of the third day the way deep sleepers wake, slowly, reluctantly, the consciousness surfacing through layers before it reached the air. His breathing changed first. Then his hands moved, slightly. Then his head lifted from her shoulder, and for a few seconds he simply existed, eyes open, taking in the light in the room and his own returned self, like a man checking that the walls are still where he left them. Then he became aware of her. He turned and looked at her at a distance of approximately 2 inches, and for just a moment, one single, unguarded moment before the armor reassembled itself, his face held nothing but a raw and wordless something that Silera would spend a very long time afterward trying to find a name for. It was not gratitude exactly. It was not relief exactly. It was the face of a man who has been, without knowing it, desperately lonely, and has just woken up next to another human being and found, to his own alarm, that he does not entirely hate it. Then the Count was back, the spine straightened, the expression closed. He looked at her and asked, in a voice gone rough from 3 days of silence, "How long?" She told him. 3 days, my lord." He processed this the way he processed all information, without visible reaction, filing it somewhere internal, moving forward. He told her she would not be returning to the kitchens. He told her she would be given chambers in the East Wing. He told her she would be available. And then he stood and walked toward the door with the bearing of a man who had not just spent 3 days sleeping in a public room on a servant's shoulder, and Silera stood too, slowly, painfully, her legs registering 3 days of stillness all at once, and stared at his retreating back. She could have said nothing. That would have been the sensible choice, the invisible choice, the choice that the architecture of this world had spent years training her to make. Instead, she said, "Available for what, exactly, my lord? I am a tea-girl." And he paused at the door. He did not turn, not yet, and the pause lasted just long enough for her to understand that the question had landed somewhere it had not been expected. Then he said, "You're whatever I require you to be," and he left. Silera stood in the empty council chamber with her tingling legs and her indented shoulder and her thoroughly upended life, and she looked at the door and she said to nobody, "He's serious, isn't he?" And Master Greaves from the doorway said, terrifyingly so. And then he brought her a cup of tea, set it in her hands, warm and steady, the way she had set 10,000 cups in 10,000 other hands, and she held it, and for a moment she understood with complete clarity that her life had just divided itself into before and after, and the line between them was 3 days on a sleeping man's shoulder, and a name said in the dark that she had not known he knew. Chapter 3. The East Wing chambers were comfortable. That was the first thing Silera noticed, and she noticed it with the specific reluctant attention of someone who does not want to be impressed but cannot quite help it. A real fire. A real bed, not the narrow shelf she shared with 2 other kitchen girls in the lower quarters. A window that looked out over the courtyard gardens rather than the drainage alley. Someone had placed a small vase of winter herbs on the windowsill, rosemary and dried lavender, and she stood in front of it for a long time on that first evening, trying to decide if it was thoughtfulness or coincidence, and finding she could not determine which answer unsettled her more. She had been given no title, no official role, no document or declaration explaining what she was now or what she was expected to do. She had been given rooms, 3 new dresses in grey and dark blue, and a single instruction relayed through Master Greaves. Present yourself at the Count's study each morning after the first bell. That was all. The keep's other servants, when they passed her in the corridors, did not know quite how to look at her. Not with the easy familiarity of colleagues, not with the deference owed to rank, but with something cautious and sideways, the look you give a thing that does not fit the categories you have available. She understood the feeling entirely. She was giving it to herself. He worked the way a machine works, without pause, without visible fatigue, without any of the small human rituals that most people use to break the day into bearable pieces. By the time Silera arrived each morning, he had already been at his desk for 2 hours. Reports were read and annotated before she had finished pouring. Documents were signed before the tea had cooled. He moved through the administration of an entire territory with the efficiency of a man who has decided that speed is a form of control, and thoroughness is a form of armor. And he did not look up when she entered, and he did not speak to her directly, and she was not entirely certain why she was there. She brought tea because it was the one thing she knew how to do in that room, and because having something in her hands gave her permission to be present without requiring a justification. She poured. She sat, not at his invitation but because there was a chair, and she had decided, quietly and without announcement, that she was done waiting to be told where she was allowed to be. He noticed. He said nothing. She chose to interpret his silence as permission and moved forward from there. On the 4th morning, she spoke first. She had been reading, over 3 days of careful positioning, the top edge of the document he was currently annotating. Lord Fenwick's levy, the garnishment order, 10% of the autumn yield, to be seized by the end of the month. She had seen Fenwick's daughter in the kitchens. She had seen the girl's hands, not the soft hands of a noble child who has never worked, but hands that had been used hard and recently, hands that told a story the documents did not. She said so. Not as a challenge, not as a petition, but simply as information she had that he did not. The way you hand someone a thing they have dropped without making a performance of the gesture. He put down his quill. He looked at her with the expression he used for unexpected variables. Not warm, not hostile, simply recalibrating. He asked what she would do. She told him, send someone to count the grain stores directly. Not take Fenwick's word, not punish Fenwick's word, but find the actual truth and decide from there. He picked up his quill. He called for Greaves. He sent an auditor to Fenwick's Eastern Holdings within the hour. He did not thank her. He did not acknowledge that the idea had been hers. But the auditor went, and that, Silera decided, was enough. The auditor returned 10 days later with a report confirming a partial crop failure, real, if not as severe as Fenwick had claimed. The garnishment was reduced. The village below Fenwick's holding received a supplementary grain allocation from the territory stores. Nobody announced it. Nobody made a speech about it. The thing simply happened, quietly, the way good governance happens when it is working correctly, not as performance but as function. Silera heard about it from Petra, who had heard it from the kitchen steward, who had a cousin in Fenwick's village. She sat with the information for a morning and did not say anything about it to the Count. She did not need to. He already knew what he had done. She suspected that was the point. The conversations began to happen without either of them deciding to have them. He would make a remark about a document, Not to her, precisely, not an invitation, more the habit of a man accustomed to thinking aloud in a room he considered empty, and she would respond because she was not empty and she had an opinion, and the opinion was usually inconvenient and occasionally correct. He would pause. Sometimes argue. Sometimes pick up his quill and write something different from what he had been about to write. Sometimes do neither, and the disagreement would sit between them in the comfortable way that disagreements sit between people who have established, without discussing it, that neither of them is going anywhere. She taught him, without calling it teaching, to ask the question behind the question. Not who is responsible for this problem, but why did this problem become possible? Not how do I punish this failure, but what would have prevented it. It was a different grammar of power, less efficient in the immediate term, more durable over time, and deeply uncomfortable for a man who had built his entire governance on the understanding that fear was the cleanest tool available. Fear was immediate, fear was legible. Fear required no nuance, no patience, no willingness to sit with the complicated possibility that the person who had wronged you might have done so for reasons that were not entirely without merit. Compassion, Silera explained to him one morning while he pretended to be reading a trade report, is not the opposite of strength. It is the longer game. Fear keeps people in line until the moment they calculate that the cost of rebellion is lower than the cost of obedience. Love, or something close enough to it, loyalty built on genuine regard rather than terror, keeps people in line long after the calculation has changed, because they are no longer doing arithmetic. They are doing something harder to quantify and much harder to break. He said nothing for a long moment after that. Then he said, "That is either very wise or very naive, and I cannot yet determine which." And she said, "Give it a year." And he almost smiled, the rusty, reluctant thing that had begun appearing at the edges of his face with increasing frequency, and which his secretary was privately cataloguing with the careful attention of a man who has waited a long time for proof that the person he serves is still, underneath everything, human. Duke Harren heard the laugh through the study door on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week. He stood in the corridor for a full seconds, genuinely uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Then he went to find Lord Cassin, because some things are too large to carry alone. It began, as these things always begin, in a private room with the door carefully closed. Duke Harren's private sitting chamber, the one his wife used for afternoon correspondence, and which now held 5 lords arranged in the careful geometry of men who are doing something they have not yet decided to call what it is. The fire was low. The wine had not been touched. This was not a social occasion. Harren spoke first because it was his room and because someone had to. He said the word they had all been circling for 3 weeks without landing on. Unstable. The Count's decisions were becoming unpredictable. Reversals where there had been consistency. Mercy where there had been certainty. A garnishment reduced. A prisoner given a hearing that should by all precedent have been denied. The whisper of grain allocations being rerouted to villages that had never received direct attention from the Count's office before. Small things individually, a pattern collectively, and at the center of the pattern always, the tea girl. Lord Cassin was the one who named it plainly, he said. She is changing him. And the room was quiet for a moment in the way rooms go quiet when someone has said the thing everyone was thinking, and the air needs a moment to adjust. Nobody disagreed. Nobody said it was impossible or unlikely or that they were imagining things. They had not been imagining things. They had watched it happen across 3 weeks of morning council sessions in which the Count's decisions had begun carrying a quality none of them had a clean word for, something that resembled, distantly and alarmingly, consideration. The fear was not that he was becoming weak. To their credit, and perhaps to their surprise, it was more specific than that. The fear was that they had spent 15 years learning the rules of a particular world, learning how to exist within it, how to protect themselves and their holdings and their families by understanding precisely what this man would and would not do. That knowledge was the only reliable currency in Vethara, and a Count who was capable of changing, who could be changed by a tea girl in 3 weeks, was a Count whose next move was suddenly terrifyingly unknowable. Predictable power, even brutal power, can be navigated. Unpredictable power cannot. and a man learning compassion from someone who poured his tea was, to Duke Harren and the four lords in that carefully closed room, the most dangerous thing they had encountered in 15 years of service. The letter to the High Council was Harren's idea. A formal communication raising concerns about the Count's recent conduct, carefully worded, nothing actionable in itself, but enough to open a conversation, enough to plant a seed. The High Council had the authority, in extraordinary circumstances, to appoint oversight. They had never exercised it in Vethara. They had never needed to. But the mechanism existed, and mechanisms, in the hands of frightened men with good lawyers, had a way of becoming very useful very quickly. They agreed to draft it by the end of the week. They shook no hands on it. This was not the kind of agreement that bore the weight of ceremony. It was quieter than that, more like a shared exhalation. A decision made in the space between words, where decisions of this kind are always really made. The door stayed closed. The fire burned low. The wine stayed untouched. Silera found out 3 days later from Petra, who had heard it from the kitchen steward, who had a talent for being in the wrong corridor at the right moment that Silera had come to regard as one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the keep. She sat with the information for 1 hour. She turned it over, examined it from every angle, weighed it against every reason to stay quiet and every reason to speak, and at the end of the hour she went to the study. She told him. Not with ceremony, not with drama, not with the deference that 4 years of carrying trays had built into her posture like a second spine. She told him the way she told him everything, directly, completely, and with the full understanding that he might respond in a way she would not like. He went very still. The kind of still that, before Silera, had reliably preceded something a great deal worse than stillness. She watched his jaw set. Watched the grey eyes go flat and distant the way they went flat when he was doing arithmetic on a problem, and the arithmetic was leading somewhere cold. She had seen that look resolve, in the weeks before she arrived in his life, into garnishments and dismissals, and the specific, targeted application of a power that did not concern itself with whether the person on the receiving end deserved it, or merely happened to be convenient. She waited. He said very quietly, "Harren." She said, "Yes," and then something happened that she had not seen before and would not forget after. The stillness did not resolve into cold arithmetic. It resolved instead into something more complicated. A man arriving, through a landscape of old instincts, at a place he had never been before and finding himself, with great uncertainty, choosing to stay there. He said, "I want to understand why he is afraid. Because afraid men do foolish things, and Harren is not a foolish man." Silera said nothing for a moment. She had not expected that sentence. She had prepared herself for the other sentence, the one about summoning, dismissing, making an example, sending a message. She had been ready to argue against it. She had not been ready to find that she did not need to. She said quietly, "That is the right question." And the Count looked at her across the desk, the way he had been looking at her since the beginning, that searching look that still had not found its name, and said nothing. But the letter to the High Council was never sent. And Duke Harren received, 2 days later, a personal invitation to a private meeting with the Count. Not a summons, not a command, an invitation in which he would be asked to speak plainly about his concerns. It was, in the history of Vethara, entirely without precedent. It was also, though nobody said it aloud, the moment the territory began, slowly, awkwardly, without any announcement, to change. Chapter 4. The invitation went out on a Tuesday, not a summons. Duke Harren had received enough of those over 15 years to know the difference in the marrow of his bones. A summons arrived on official parchment with the Voss seal pressed deep, and the language of command running through it like iron through stone. This was different. This was a note, almost informal, written in the Count's own hand rather than Greaves's careful script, requesting Harren's presence at a private meeting in the study. The word requesting. Harren read it 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time, because he was a thorough man and because he suspected his own understanding of it might be wrong. It was not wrong. The most feared Count in the Northern Territories had written the word requesting, and underlined nothing, and threatened nothing, and the blankness where the threat should have been was somehow more unsettling than any threat Harren had received in a decade and a half of service. He went. Of course he went. A man does not decline an invitation from Count Aldrich Voss, requesting or otherwise, unless he has made his peace with every consequence that follows. But he went differently than he would have gone to a summons, not braced for impact, not calculating survival, but carrying instead the strange, suspended feeling of a man walking into a room whose rules he does not yet know. That feeling, Harren would later admit privately to Lord Cassin, was more frightening than anything the Count had ever done to him directly. Because fear, when it has a shape, can be prepared for. This had no shape. This was simply open. The study looked the same as it always had. Maps and ledgers and the particular quality of silence that accumulated in rooms where serious work was done seriously. What was different was the chair on the other side of the desk, pulled out, positioned, clearly intended. An invitation to sit, wordless and exact. Harren sat. The Count looked at him across the desk for a moment without speaking, and in that moment Harren was acutely aware of the tea things on the side table. 2 cups, he noticed, already poured. Not 1. 2. Silera was not in the room. She had not been invited to this meeting, and Harren understood, without it being said, that this was a deliberate choice. That the Count was giving him a room without her in it, a space where the conversation could happen without the added weight of her presence, where Harren could say what he needed to say without the complication of saying it in front of the person it concerned. It was, Harren would think afterward, a remarkably considerate arrangement for a man who had not previously demonstrated any particular interest in consideration. The Count said, "Tell me what you are afraid of." And Harren, who had prepared several versions of several careful statements on his walk across the keep, found that none of them were adequate and said, instead, the plain truth. He said, "I am afraid of a world I do not recognize. I have governed alongside you for 15 years by understanding your methods. Your decisions have been consistent. We knew where we stood, my lord. We knew what you would and would not do, and we built everything, our strategies, our protections, our counsel, on that foundation. And now the foundation is moving, and I am too old and too tired to start again from nothing." Silence. Then the Count said something Harren had not expected. He said, "I know." And the words were quiet, and without armor, and contained, somewhere in their plainness, an acknowledgement that the disruption was real. That Harren's fear was not foolishness, but a reasonable response to an unreasonable change, and that the Count understood this because he had been living inside the change and found it no less disorienting from the inside than apparently it was from the outside. He said, "I am not the same as I was 6 months ago. I cannot tell you with certainty what I am becoming. But I can tell you that the decisions that have changed, the garnishment, the prisoner's hearing, the grain allocation, I do not regret them. I looked more carefully than I had before, and I found that looking more carefully produced better outcomes. That is not instability, Harren. That is correction. And a man who cannot correct himself when the evidence requires it is not strong. He is simply static. There is a difference." Harren was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "And the girl, my lord, Silera, what is she to you?" The question he had been circling for weeks finally landed. The Count looked at the window. And then he said the thing that would travel, in various forms, from Harren to Cassin to every lord in the territory within a fortnight. "She is the first person in this keep who has told me when I was wrong and wanted nothing from me afterward. She has no title to protect, no holdings to safeguard, no political interest that my approval could serve. She tells me the truth because she is constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise, and that, in a room full of men whose honesty has always been conditional, is worth more than anything I could put a number on." Harren looked at the 2 cups of tea on the side table. He looked at the map on the wall behind the Count's head, the territory of Vethara, every road and holding and village marked in careful ink. He looked at the man across the desk, who was 32 years old and had not slept in 6 months and had fallen asleep in a council session on the shoulder of a tea girl and woken up, apparently, into a different version of himself. He picked up his cup. He drank. He said, "I will not send the letter, my lord." And the Count nodded, once, and that was the end of it. Clean and without theatre, the way things end when the people involved have said what they actually meant and found that it was enough. The full council met 3 days later. All 12 chairs occupied, all 12 lords and dukes present. The chamber restored to its official configuration after weeks of smaller meetings and quiet revisions and the slow, collective recalibration of men adjusting to a world that had shifted on its axis. Silera sat at the Count's right hand. She had a cup of tea. She had not brought it for anyone else. She had made it for herself in the kitchen that morning and carried it across the keep and placed it on the council table in front of her own chair, and nobody, not one person in that room, said a word about it. The Count opened the session by addressing the matter directly, because he had become, in the past weeks, a man who addressed things directly, and this was one of the smaller changes Silera had wrought in him that she had not entirely noticed because it had happened so gradually. He said, "You have questions about the direction of this council's recent decisions. Ask them. Plainly. Now." Lord Cassin, who had always been the more honest of the two ringleaders, asked first. He said, "Are the reversals we have seen recent policy, or are they exceptions?" The Count said, "They are the beginning of a method. The method is this: gather more information before acting, and be willing to change course when the information requires it. That is all. It is not softness, it is accuracy." Lord Cassin nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing something away. One of the younger lords, Lord Fenwick's nephew as it happened, newly elevated and still learning the room, asked the question nobody else had been brave or naive enough to voice directly. He said, "My lord, who is she?" And the room went very still, the specific stillness of people pretending they are not paying attention while paying the most attention they have paid to anything all year. Count Aldrich Voss turned to look at Silera. She met his eyes across the short distance between their chairs, and she could see him arriving at the sentence the way she had watched him arrive at difficult decisions in the study. The brief internal reckoning, the weighing, and then the precise, irreversible commitment. He said, "She is the reason I slept for the first time in 6 months. She is the reason Lord Fenwick's village did not go hungry through the winter. She is the person who told me, without ceremony and without wanting anything from me in return, that power exercised without regard for the people under it is not strength, it is waste. And she was right." He paused. The room was the quietest it had been since the morning 6 weeks ago when he had fallen asleep in it. He said, "She will be at this table, officially, permanently. If anyone has an objection, I would like to hear it now, while I am still in the habit of listening." Nobody objected. Harren, who might once have been the one to speak, looked at his cup and said nothing. And the session continued. Reports and routes and levies and all the ordinary machinery of governance, with Silera at the Count's right hand, not pouring for anyone, just present, just there, taking up exactly the space she was owed. After the council, after the lords had filed out, and Greaves had quietly closed every door between the study and the rest of the keep, the Count placed a small box on the desk between them. Old wood, unadorned, the kind of container that has been in a family long enough to lose the ceremony and retain only the weight. Silera looked at it. She did not reach for it. He said, "Open it." Inside was a ring, not a jeweler's ring, not ornament, not display, heavy old silver, dark with age and wearing, with a small deep-set stone the color of winter water, a seal ring. She recognized the Voss crest worked into the metal and understood in the same moment what she was holding. This was not a gift. This was not a reward. This was something that had not been given in 40 years. The Countess's ring, passed from the last woman who had held this title to a future that had simply never arrived. "Until now," she said, "I am a tea-girl." Not because she had forgotten the morning's council. Not because she was uncertain of the ground they had been slowly building toward for 6 weeks, but because she needed to say it out loud one more time. Needed him to hear it and confirm, explicitly, that he understood what he was asking, that he was not confusing her with something else, that he was not elevating an idea of her while remaining ignorant of the actual her, who had roughened hands and a mother 3 streets outside the wall and opinions about grain allocation, and no interest whatsoever in performing gratitude for things she had not been given a choice about. He said, "I know what you are." And then he said the things that undid her, not with dramatics, not with the rhetoric of a man making a speech, but in the flat, precise language of someone reading from a document they have considered carefully and revised until only the true parts remained. He said she had taught him that power without humanity was architecture without foundation. impressive until the first serious wait. He said she had shown him that the people who carried the trays through the rooms where decisions were made were not furniture, but evidence. Evidence of how the decisions were actually landing, which was information no ledger could provide. He said she had told him the truth when everyone else had told him what he wished to hear, and she had done it without wanting his gratitude, his approval, or his protection, which meant he trusted it in the way he trusted almost nothing else in his life. And then he said the last thing, the quiet thing, the thing that sat underneath all the other things and had been sitting there, she suspected, since the morning in the council chamber when he had looked up from his cup and stopped a room without meaning to. He said, "I do not want someone who will be what I require. I have had that. I have had rooms full of it for 32 years. I want someone who will tell me when I am wrong, who already does." Silera looked at the ring in the box. She looked at the silver, which had held the weight of the Voss name across generations, and which was now sitting on a desk between a count and a tea girl in the quiet of an evening study. "Waiting," she said. "If I take this, I will not stop arguing with you," he said. "I am counting on it," she said. "I will send someone to check on Phoenix Village every quarter," he said. "I will have it added to the official schedule," she said. "I will still make my own tea," he said, and this time the almost smile reached all the way. "The kitchens are at your disposal." She picked up the ring. She held it for a long moment, the weight of it, the cold of old silver, the specific gravity of a life about to divide itself again at a line she had not drawn and had not expected and was choosing, now, with her eyes open and her hands steady, to cross. She said, "I will need time to think." He said, "Yes." She said, "This is not a small thing." He said, "No." And then she said, almost to herself, "You fell asleep on my shoulder in front of your entire council and called my name, and somehow that is less frightening than this conversation." And he said, "Yes, just that. Yes." She closed her hand around the ring. She did not put it back in the box. It was not the occasion Duke Harren had initially proposed. He had suggested something appropriate to the weight of the moment, a formal investiture, a state banquet, the full ceremonial architecture that a Countess of Vethara had not been crowned in 40 years, and which the territory would, he argued, expect. The Count had listened to this proposal with the attentiveness he now brought to most things, and then declined it in 2 sentences. Silera had been consulted. She had said, "Something small." He had agreed immediately, with a speed that suggested he had been hoping for exactly that answer. So it was small. The great hall, cleared and lit but not decorated beyond what was decent. The lords present because they were meant to be, not because they had been given elaborate cause for celebration. Petra in the second row with her handkerchief, already in use before the proceedings had properly begun. Master Greaves at his post, standing with 30 years of service in his spine, and something in his face that he would later describe, to no one, as satisfaction, the deep, unperformative kind that comes not from an event but from the conclusion of something that was always, eventually, going to resolve this way. Silera wore the silver ring. She had been wearing it for 3 months, not publicly, not officially, but in the mornings in the study and the evenings in the East Wing, and all the hours between that had accumulated, quietly and without announcement, into a life. She had written to her mother. Her mother had come to the keep, had sat in the East Wing chambers with a cup of tea, and looked at her daughter for a long time, and had said only, "Are you well?" Silera had said, "Yes." Her mother had looked at her for another moment and said, "Then I am satisfied." And that had been that, simple and sufficient, the way things are simple and sufficient between people who know each other all the way down. The Count stood beside her with the ease of a man who has, over the course of 3 months and several hundred morning arguments about grain allocations and governance philosophy, and the correct steeping time for black tea, arrived at something he does not have a clean word for, and has decided he does not need one. He slept each night. He had slept every night for 3 months. The physicians noted this with tremendous scientific interest, and said they could not explain it. Greaves could have explained it. He chose not to. After the ceremony, when the hall had emptied and the candles were burning low and it was only the 2 of them in the long quiet of a room that held 30 years of Voss history in its walls, she poured 2 cups of tea from the pot someone had thoughtfully left on the side table and handed him one, and they stood at the tall window and looked out over the territory. The same fields and roads and villages it had always been, the same people in the morning rising before dawn, the same world turning, he said. "Are you afraid?" She said, "Of what specifically?" He said, "Of getting this wrong, of the weight of it." She considered this honestly, the way she considered everything, turning it over to examine the underside. Then she said, "I am afraid of the weight. I am not afraid of getting it wrong, because I know you will tell me when I do, and I will tell you when you do, and between the two of us there will always be someone paying attention. That is all governance really is. Someone paying attention and being willing to say what they see." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is either the most reassuring thing I have ever heard or the most terrifying." She said, "It is both. That's how you know it's true." Outside, the last light was going from the sky. Inside, the tea was warm. The ring was on her finger, old silver Voss seal, 40 years of waiting resolved into one woman's hand. And Count Aldrich Voss, the most feared ruler in the northern territories, the man who had ended a war with a severed hand and could not stay awake in the presence of a tea-girl, stood at the window of his own hall and was, in the specific and uncomplicated way that a man is when he has finally stopped pretending that walls are the same as safety, at rest.